Computers are truly an incredible feat of human engineering. They've been with us for around 70 years now, getting better and better as our understanding improves with time. If you've ever talked to someone about them, or overheard a conversation, there's a chance you may be confused about some of the stuff they're talking about. RAM? What even is a graphics card? The core what now? It all seems daunting, if not a little overwhelming. And while I could go on for hours and really dig in deep with each component, I don't feel like spending that much time of my life on this, so I'll give a brief explanation about each component. There are 7 key parts to any desktop computer, separated into 2 categories, simple and complex. These 7 components are the case, power supply, motherboard, CPU, RAM, storage drive, and graphics card. Let's start with the easy items. The case is a pretty straightforward component. The case of a computer is commonly a large, hollow metal box with removable front, side, and back panels for maneuvering around your system. Some higher-end cases have fancy lighting and special screws for added features, but when it's all said and done, the case is simply a large enclosed box for housing all parts of your computer. Next up, we have the power supply. The power supply is most commonly found on the bottom of any given computer and is the part that plugs into wall outlets. It is responsible for delivering sufficient power to each of your computer's components in order for them to do their jobs. In a nutshell, it's just an extremely advanced AC adapter. Without a motherboard, you wouldn't be able to have a computer. Like how a mothership hosts all of its units, soldiers, and leaders, a motherboard hosts all of the computer's components. Simply put, the motherboard's job is to hold all of the components of a computer in place, whilst interconnecting them all to each other for communication and data transfer. There are designated slots on the motherboard for the CPU, RAM, graphics card, and storage device, all easy to differentiate from one another. The motherboard has what's known as the BIOS, Basic Input-Output System, which is simply a firmware chip on the motherboard itself that cannot be removed. The BIOS has a few jobs, one being the responsibility of powering the system after a user presses the power button for their computer. Upon activation, the BIOS does a quick check to ensure that all necessary components are in place and working for the computer to run, then proceeds to check the boot device, the storage piece where the operating system is stored. If everything checks out, the BIOS then allocates the drivers for your components that communicate with the operating system, then finally boots the computer. The Central Processing Unit, or CPU for short, is the component where your computer executes commands and starts programs and processes. The CPU doesn't have the capability to store very much data within itself, but it is very good at figuring out what to do with the data it receives. The CPU is able to quickly read and arrange data, as well as do the intense and difficult calculations needed to run the programs on a user's computer. This little piece of hardware is essentially where your programs are run from. The CPU takes bits of data in the form of instructions from the RAM and from there performs the previously mentioned calculations, organizes the results, and sends it out to wherever it needs to be, whether that is video output or input from a mouse or keyboard. The CPU sends out and receives data via tiny pins on the bottom of the processor that insert into a designated socket on the motherboard. From there, the miniature wires on the board carry the data to their destination. It is often referred to as the brain of the computer, which is justified by the fact that it does most of the thinking and commanding in the system. Random access memory, or RAM for short, plays a vital role in the operation of any computer. As mentioned before, it feeds data to the CPU so that the processor can execute functions. A stick of RAM, or a DIMM in its technical term, hosts the small chips and connector pins necessary for the module to operate. Before feeding data to the central processor, the RAM loads what's needed from the hard drive where the program is stored. If RAM has enough capacity, it is able to hold all of the data on it for the CPU to access. On the other hand, if the memory doesn't have enough capacity, the RAM will have to feed data to the CPU while simultaneously grabbing data from the storage device, effectively slowing down the RAM's performance. This is why many higher-end computers operate with anywhere from 16 to 128 gigabytes of RAM. Because higher-end computers have more temporary storage to work with, they are not slowed down by RAM needing to multitask. Capacity, of course, is not the only determining factor in RAM's performance. Much like a CPU or a GPU, a RAM module's speed is a core factor in how it will perform. Speed for RAM, unlike the CPU, is measured in megahertz, with the higher value meaning the stick is quicker at transferring data. While RAM's job is simple enough, it is crucial to the computer that its job is performed as efficiently as possible. The graphics processing unit, also known as the GPU, is a handy piece of hardware that is responsible for putting what a user is doing onto the screen for them to see. For some computers, the graphics processor is built into the core processor and uses the same memory as it as well, meaning that it is slow, weak, and generally useless for any form of interactive entertainment on a person's computer. The processor aboard the graphics card is a simple yet very complex job. What it is tasked with doing is completing complex equations regarding the translation and transformation of 3D objects whilst managing all of the millions of pixels to ensure they're displaying what they're supposed to be. It acts as a sort of translator by turning the binary data received from the CPU into a visible image. Where a graphics processing unit has a massive leg up on integrated graphics is the fact that the GPU has its own dedicated memory, known as VRAM, that no other part of the computer can use. This memory is very quick and for good reason. The GPU has to output anywhere from a mere 30 pictures, better known as frames, per second, to upwards of 240 on high-end computers. To manage this, the GPU needs the memory to have the capacity to hold pixel data, completed frames, proper colors, and where its location on screen is supposed to be, while also needing high speeds for the processor chip to give and take data from the VRAM fast enough to keep up a steady, smooth image. GPUs even have their own BIOS. The BIOS in a GPU is responsible for diagnostic data regarding the VRAM, input-output, which would be the HDMI port, display port, VGA port, and startup of the graphics card, but is also responsible for remembering the GPU's settings. Every task your computer completes needs a starting point, whether it's big or small. Much like a computer's RAM, these storage devices hold on to all the data needed to run a program or put an image on screen for a user. But the core difference is that unlike RAM, this isn't temporary. With RAM, as soon as a program is closed or power is lost to the component, the RAM will discard any and all data it is holding on to, whereas with storage devices, unless expressly deleted by the computer's user, through power loss, program termination, or complete removal from the system, the storage drive will cling onto that data. There are a few different types of storage devices. They're known as 1. The magnetic hard drive or hard disk drive, 2. The solid state drive, and 3. The hybrid drive. Hard disk drives have been around since the dawn of the computer, first created in 1956 by a company known as IBM. Unlike other forms of technology, the earliest version of computer storage is still alive and thriving to this day, with the majority of computers hosting an HDD inside of it. Inside the tough external shell of the hard drive, there is a series of quickly rotating disks and a small metal arm that sits just above the disks within. The aforementioned arm has 2 bits on it, a read bit for taking the data out of the hard drive to other parts of the computer, and a write bit for storing new data onto the drive. The ARM does this by utilizing a small magnetic coating that is on the spinning disk, writing 0s and 1s as tiny areas of magnetic north or south. Hard drives, while not the fastest storage method, are very cost-effective and are a great way to store things like documents, pictures, videos, and any other non-crucial file or program. The solid-state drive is the newer, snappier storage method that is a go-to for gaming enthusiasts or users that need quick access to data. The name solid-state drive comes from the fact that, unlike how HDDs use a spinning disk and ARM for read-write, the SSD utilizes flash memory chips to store data. There are no moving parts within. Because there are no moving parts, the SSD is quicker, quieter, and much more energy efficient than their older counterparts. SSDs come in 2 different form factors, one being a standard 2.5-inch drive that looks like an HDD, and the other being a smaller stick known as an M.2. SSDs, while better in every aspect compared to its predecessor, are much more expensive, but a user most certainly does get what they pay for with one. Hybrid drives, or SSHDs, are the best of both worlds. These devices utilize the magnetic disk's large capacity and the flash memory's quick transfer speeds. No matter what a user decides to use for storage, though, all drives will die at some point. It is important to note that SSDs tend to have a much longer lifespan than the other types of drives depending on the intensity of usage.